Two little girls abandoned with a suitcase in an airport, until a billionaire stopped and asked one question that changed everything. Ryan Gray had walked through countless airports in his career, never once imagining that a single glance could stop him cold. That morning, as he strode through the main terminal with his assistant trailing behind him carrying files and itinerary printouts, he was thinking only about the meeting ahead, how many millions it might bring in, how quickly he could return to the safety of his corner office where nothing and no one could surprise him. He wore his favorite blue suit, perfectly pressed, the expensive watch on his wrist catching the fluorescent light overhead. Even in a crowd, he always carried the same aura, someone too focused to be interrupted. But as he turned toward the private security lane, a flicker of movement caught his eye, something that didn't belong in the orderly stream of travelers and their purposeful strides. Two little girls stood alone near the end of the check-in counters, so still they almost seemed part of the scenery. It took him a moment to register what he was seeing. They were small, maybe 5 years old, and clearly twins, identical brown hair in tidy braids, identical wide blue eyes that scanned the hall with the blank, stunned look of children who hadn't yet decided whether to be afraid or to hope someone would come back for them. Each wore a yellow and white dress that looked too light for the chilly air conditioning, and together they clung to the handle of a single gray suitcase that was nearly as big as they were. For a second, Ryan tried to look away. It wasn't his place. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped to ask strangers if they were all right. But he couldn't ignore the way one of the girls shifted her weight, glancing at the departure boards and then back at the entrance doors as though she half expected her world to reappear. He told himself he would take just a moment. Just long enough to be sure someone was coming for them. As he approached, he felt the old, unfamiliar sensation of his heartbeat speeding up, the cold of the tile floor seeping through the soles of his shoes. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat, lowering his voice so it wouldn't sound too sharp. "Are you two waiting for someone?" he asked carefully, not wanting to startle them. The twins looked up in perfect unison, and the look in their eyes, open, vulnerable, exhausted, hit him harder than he was ready for. The one on the left, he would learn her name was Maddie, blinked slowly as though she was trying to decide if he was real or just another adult who would keep walking. The other, her voice so thin it nearly vanished in the vast hall, whispered, "Our daddy flew away without us." It wasn't the words themselves that made his stomach lurch but the simple, quiet certainty in her tone. Like she knew this was just how life worked. Ryan felt something constrict behind his ribs, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He glanced around, half expecting to see a frantic parent running toward them. But there was no one. Just travelers hurrying past, never noticing the two little girls who had been left behind. He knelt down so he could look them in the eyes without towering over them, his suit creasing as he rested one hand lightly on the suitcase between them. "Where's your mom?" he asked, and for a moment he wished he could swallow the question back, because he already knew from the way their eyes went glassy. Maddie lifted her chin and said in a voice so heartbreakingly steady, "She died." Ryan didn't have any words left. He only sat there, frozen, as the reality settled around them like something solid and heavy. Two little girls alone in an airport, abandoned by the only parent they had left. He felt his throat tighten, and before he could think about how it must look, this man in a flawless suit kneeling on the floor with tears threatening his composure, he reached out and rested his hand over theirs where they clutched the handle of the suitcase. He didn't know why, but it felt important that they know he wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. Ryan didn't know how long he stayed kneeling there in front of the girls, feeling the strange mixture of helplessness and determination that had begun to take root in his chest. He could feel the occasional curious glance from passers-by, but no one slowed down, no one asked if the children needed help. It was as though the rest of the world had agreed to pretend they weren't there, two small figures clutching each other and their single suitcase as if it were the last anchor they had. He drew in a slow, steadying breath and told himself he had to be the one to do something. He couldn't simply stand up, straighten his cuffs, and keep walking back into the safe, predictable world he'd built around himself. He glanced up and saw an airline attendant watching them from behind her counter, her expression wary but sympathetic. He raised a hand in a silent gesture for her to wait. Then he turned back to the girls. "My name is Ryan," he said, making his voice as calm as he could manage. "I know you don't know me, but I promise I want to help you. Can you tell me your names?" The girl who had spoken first drew in a breath that sounded shaky but brave. "I'm Maddie," she said softly, her hand tightening on the suitcase handle. "This is Lily." She looked at her sister, who nodded as though confirming that yes, this was all the information a stranger needed to have. But Ryan knew it wasn't nearly enough. He looked down at the luggage tag he'd noticed before. The handwriting on it was rushed, the marker smudged. Madison and Lillian Carter, no contact number. No forwarding address. Just their names, as if that was all their father had thought to leave behind. He felt something go cold inside him. He had heard of parents walking away, but standing here face to face with the reality of it, the cruelty of it, made his hands shake. He rested them flat on his knees so the girls wouldn't see. "Maddie, Lily," he said carefully, "do you know where your daddy went?" Maddie swallowed and lifted her chin in that small, determined way she would come to do whenever she was trying not to cry. "He said he was going somewhere far. Somewhere we couldn't go." Her lower lip trembled, and Ryan felt something in his own heart splinter. He reached out without thinking and gently placed his hand over hers. She looked down at their joined hands with an expression so solemn it made his throat tighten again. "I'm so sorry," he said, because there was nothing else honest he could think to say. "You didn't deserve that. None of this is your fault." Lily shifted closer to her sister and pressed her cheek against Maddie's arm, and Ryan realized that they were both shivering now, whether from fear or from the cold air he couldn't be sure. He straightened slowly and glanced around the terminal, feeling the practical part of his mind kick back in. He had no plan. No right to intervene. But he knew he couldn't leave them. He took out his phone and called the only person he trusted to handle something this delicate, his lawyer, Margaret, who had been with him through every corporate disaster and personal misstep. While the phone rang, he crouched again, lowering his voice. "I'm going to call someone who can help us figure out what to do. You don't have to be afraid. I promise I won't go anywhere." Maddie studied him, her blue eyes bright with confusion and something like wary hope. She nodded once, as if to say she was willing to believe him, at least for now. When Margaret finally picked up, he stepped a few feet away but kept the girls in his sight. He explained quickly, trying to keep his voice steady as he described what he'd found. He heard the shock in her silence and then the professionalism in her questions. Were there any tags? Any documentation? Any sign that this was a misunderstanding? He answered everything as best he could, feeling his own disbelief with every word. When he ended the call, Margaret promised she'd contact Child Protective Services immediately and send someone to the airport. But even as he hung up, he knew he wasn't going to hand them over to strangers and walk away. He turned back to see Maddie and Lily watching him with identical expressions, so small and exhausted, but somehow still expectant, as if some part of them hadn't yet let go of the idea that someone might be coming back for them. He walked over slowly and sank down to one knee again. "Help is coming," he said quietly, "but until then, I'm going to stay right here with you." He paused, searching their faces for any flicker of fear. "Would that be okay?" Maddie nodded. Lily didn't say anything, but she reached out and rested her tiny hand against his wrist. The warmth of that simple touch nearly undid him. And as he sat there in the middle of the bustling terminal, he realized that for the first time in years, he didn't care if he missed his flight. Some things were simply more important. Ryan wasn't sure how long they sat together on the cold tile floor of the terminal while the morning traffic of travelers flowed around them in steady waves. He kept expecting that someone official would arrive quickly, a security officer, a social worker, someone whose job it was to know exactly how to handle this. But the minutes dragged on, and no one came. His phone vibrated twice with calls from his assistant and once from a board member who must have already noticed he had missed his flight. He didn't answer any of them. He kept the girls within arm's reach, feeling that if he looked away even for a moment, they might vanish or worse, slip back into the shadows where no one would ever see them. The thought made his chest tighten until it was hard to draw a steady breath. He watched Maddie and Lily as they sat pressed together, so close it was as though they believed they could only stay safe if their shoulders touched. Every few minutes, Lily would rest her cheek against Maddie's arm and close her eyes, but she never fully relaxed. Maddie kept glancing up at him, her small face serious and searching. It occurred to him that she was trying to decide whether he was trustworthy, whether he was just another adult who would promise something he couldn't keep. He wished he had some paper or a toy, something to distract them from the vast emptiness of the terminal and the fact that everyone who passed by pretended not to see them. But all he had to give was his presence, and he hoped, absurdly, that it was enough. At last, when he felt almost ready to stand up and start demanding answers from anyone in a uniform, his phone lit up with Margaret's name. He answered so quickly he nearly fumbled it. She explained in her precise, calm voice that she had contacted Child Protective Services and that an emergency social worker had been dispatched. It could still be another hour before they arrived. She said she could arrange for him to leave them in the care of airport security, but even as she spoke, Ryan knew he wouldn't do that. He thanked her quietly, ignoring the strain in her voice when she reminded him he was under no legal obligation to stay. When the call ended, he looked at the twins and felt something final settle inside him. Obligation had nothing to do with this. It was a choice he'd already made. He shifted closer so they wouldn't have to strain to hear him. "Someone is coming to help," he said gently. "They'll make sure you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight." Lily's lower lip wobbled, but she didn't cry. Maddie looked straight at him and asked in a whisper, "Will you come too?" Her voice cracked on the last word, as if she'd been holding it in until she couldn't anymore. Ryan swallowed against the sudden ache in his throat. He thought of all the meetings and deals he had once believed were the measure of his life. None of them had ever made him feel this certain. "If they'll let me," he said honestly, "I'll be there." The relief on her face was so immediate and so unguarded that he had to look away for a moment to keep from losing his composure. They waited in that little pocket of quiet, the hum of announcements and rolling suitcases blending into a steady backdrop. Eventually, an airport worker approached with a paper cup of apple juice and 2 small packets of crackers. She knelt and offered them with a kind smile, and Maddie took them carefully, her fingers trembling just a little. Ryan murmured his thanks, and when the woman walked away, he noticed her eyes were wet. For the first time, he realized how many people had been watching from a distance, people who were moved but didn't know how to step in. Maddie tore open the cracker packet with determined little motions and handed half to Lily before nibbling the corner of her own piece. He felt such fierce admiration for her composure that it almost hurt. He couldn't help but think of Lily, his Lily, and how often she had needed reassurance when she was this small. He remembered holding her hand when she was sick, how her whole body seemed to relax when she knew he wasn't going anywhere. He wondered if these girls had ever known what that felt like, that absolute certainty that someone would always come back for them. His throat was tight when he finally spoke again. "I'm glad you told me your names," he said, his voice low and rough. "That was very brave." Maddie looked up, and for the first time, there was something almost like hope in her expression. "Are you going to stay until they come?" she asked. He nodded without hesitation. "Yes. I promise." Lily shifted her weight until she was leaning against his arm, and Maddie rested her head on his shoulder, the tiniest sigh escaping her. It felt as though they had decided, for this one moment, that he was safe. And even though he knew there were no guarantees, that everything could still change, he realized he would do whatever it took to prove they were right. Ryan didn't think he would ever forget the feeling of those 2 small heads resting against him in the middle of the airport. For a man who had built his entire adult life around the idea that vulnerability was a weakness to be hidden behind polished suits and airtight contracts, it was almost disorienting to realize how natural it felt to sit there on the floor and simply be a steady presence for children he had known less than an hour. Every so often, Lily would shift, her cheek brushing against his sleeve, and Maddie would tighten her grip on the suitcase handle as though she needed to remind herself it hadn't disappeared. He found that he didn't mind any of it. If anything, the quiet weight of their trust anchored him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't until he heard the soft, clipped steps approaching that he lifted his head and saw the social worker walking toward them. She was a woman in her 40s with a calm face and a blue lanyard around her neck, holding out a badge so there could be no confusion about who she was. Ryan felt Maddie and Lily stiffen beside him, the instinctive recoil of children who had already learned that official voices often meant more loss. He laid a hand